Welcome to this month's webinar, White in America. My name is Tanya Rollins, and I am the CPS Disproportionality Manager. Thank you for taking the time to come and join us again. We know that we had to reschedule the last time due to technical issues. We do truly appreciate your joining us today. Before I introduce our speaker, John Olson, I want to cover a few group agreements. Please use the question field to ask any questions. If you are a DFPS employee, you will receive a link to the DFPS Learning Station after the holidays. This will allow you to take the assessment and receive credit. If you are an external stakeholder, you will receive a certificate if you are logged into the GoToWebinar system. If you are not online, then there is not a mechanism to verify your presence today. You are in listen-only mode. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to start by introducing our speaker. John Olson, MSSW, is the Director of Equity and Inclusion for the Office of Minority Health Statistics and Engagement, Health and Human Services Commission in Austin, Texas. After completing 1 year of service with AmeriCorps Vista in Alaska, he returned to Austin and began working with the Department of Family and Protective Services in March 2002. John worked for the department in a variety of positions, including conservatorship supervisor, facilitator, and program director in family group decision making, and state disproportionality specialist. John joined OMHSE in May of 2012 as the project specialist, handling data analysis and report writing, and other state-level projects. He joined the Equity and Inclusion team in November of 2014. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Mr. John Olson.
Hi, Tanya, and thank you. And hi, everyone. Appreciate you coming on and making the time. And for those of you that tried to join us a few weeks ago, we thank you for your patience and sticking with us. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I just wanted to share a disclaimer that you can see there on your screen, that I prepared this kind of on my own and not in my role that Tanya described earlier. So the information I'm sharing with you does not reflect an official position of any of those organizations. Because of the nature of the topic, I thought I'd do something I don't normally in presentations, is to share a little bit more about who I am. So who is this yapping at you? That's me. I'm the one on the left in this slide. Tanya shared some of my bio, but I want to tell you a little bit more in detail. For many of us, race equity work is a particular passion, and I'm no different. And we'll return to some of this later in the presentation. I have now about 15 years, 8 months, 14 days, and 5 hours of time with the state. And I've worked beginning with children and families, and then in more policy and administrative positions over the last few years. But with a background in child welfare and human services, why would I today be talking to you about being white in America? And that leads me to share a bit more about my race equity journey with you. This concept is not new to you if you've ever participated in knowing who you are, and I'm a big fan of the concept. So I'm from Lubbock, Texas originally, and I didn't grow up in activist families like some of my friends do. I wasn't out protesting in onesies or anything like that. But I was raised, like probably many of you, with a colorblind perspective. I was taught not to see race and certainly not to address people or treat them differently based on their race. And I carried that experience with me into my work. After I graduated college, I joined AmeriCorps and spent a year in Alaska, as Tanya noted, and I lived on a small island with about 650 other people. Maybe 2 white people on that island, and everyone else was Aleut, a tribe of Alaskan natives. And they welcomed me in, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I was really moving forward in my journey of race equity as I saw how different their culture and community was and how institutions treated them differently as well. After that, I joined CPS as a caseworker, and one of my earliest cases made me feel pretty uncomfortable. The primary parent was an African American man, and he was in what we call back then a permanency planning team meeting. I know I'm dating myself with that terminology, but although that name has changed, child welfare agencies all over the country conduct these permanency meetings every day. Back then, I was a 24-year-old young white man and new to this work and this job, and I remember looking around the room, and all of us that were providing input into this family situation and their case were white. There was me, my supervisor, the attorney ad litem, the TASA volunteer, and the facilitator. All of us except the father were white. He was African American, and he had grown up very differently than I had, and I suspect my colleagues in the room too. Something about that felt uncomfortable to me. I didn't have words to describe it, or didn't really understand why I felt that way, but I did. And I mentioned that to a mentor of mine, and she encouraged me to focus on that child and that family situation, because I couldn't do anything to impact the dynamics that had led them to be there. And I've come to find that is true, but inadequate. In 2005, CPS began addressing disproportionality formally after being the first state in the country with a legislative mandate, and I was very energized. There were finally words to describe what I was seeing, and I'm very thankful to have been on this journey with the agency. For me, it's a belief that government should work well for everyone in America, and that problems and issues in our communities are shaped by our institutions, and those institutions should change to become more responsive to the needs of all of our people. Through that process, I began to analyze my practice and change based on what I was learning from training and colleagues and friends and mentors. So I worked to become race conscious or race aware in my work as opposed to colorblind. And that was a little bit about what I wanted to share with you. I'm also a proud cancer survivor, so I talk a little bit different, and that's part of who I am as well. So in case you were wondering, that's why I sound this way. Reviewing our objectives for the day, you see them there on the screen. I won't read them to you, but we're going to define a few key terms and then examine a few moments in the evolution of the concept of white people that jump out at me as being particularly important. We will then look at internalized racial superiority and its manifestations and how it can impact our work in social services. And then I'll share a few strategies for white people, or what we can do to support social justice movements. So moving right into a few terms, you may have heard the phrase that race is a social construct. And we may kick that around a lot without necessarily knowing what that means. So here are a couple of definitions of a construct. And by the way, you may see several definitions. I like to look at a few different ones to try and get at the connotation or the sense or the meaning of a word. So here, Merriam-Webster has a construct as a product of ideology, history, or social circumstances. Dictionary.com has this as an image, an idea, or theory, especially a complex one formed by a number of simpler elements. So if we add the term social to that, you can see these definitions. An idea created and accepted by the people in a society. A social mechanism, phenomenon, or category created and developed by society. A perception that is built up through cultural or social practice. Another social construct in the U.S. is class. We hear about upper, middle, working, and lower classes, but the ideas change over time, and we come to accept them. There isn't a firm, say, income amount that you make to move from working to middle class. That is another social construction. Social constructs are very powerful things, and they have a big role in shaping our reality. So with that, let's look at race. Here are 3 different definitions, and as you were looking at those, I would offer that this is a really difficult word to nail down. Race is something that in America we all have, we are all assigned. But if we asked everyone on this webinar to submit a definition, we would probably have dozens or maybe even as many different definitions as there are participants. So you can see that the dictionary definition includes that race is a socially constructed category. And another one of those has it as an arbitrary classification scheme. So another one that I think is a bit more relevant is here in front of you. And this one is used by Karinga, Barnes, and the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. I like this definition because it brings in some of our history. And this definition has a lot of words. We could easily spend the entire time unpacking it. We could probably spend the whole day just talking about this. So what jumps out to me about this is that it's false. The idea of race that we have today is specious and false, not true. That doesn't mean that we don't have biological differences between people. But those different physical characteristics that we are taught to associate with race are more accurately attributed to geography. Another part of this definition that jumps out at me is that it was constructed by Europeans. So the idea of race came to us from Europeans. It didn't develop independently by scholars in Africa or Asia. It was a particular European invention. And another part that I feel is important is that the invention of this idea was by people that we now call white, and it ultimately benefited people that we now call white. So just a few more things about this, and we will pause to see if you all have any comments. But I wanted to bring a little bit more to bear on the idea that race is not biological. And these two quotes help to shed light on that. While we all have biological differences, it's the categories that are the human inventions, our social constructs. There aren't discrete categories of humans that we can select based on a phenotype or how we do. Those categories are invented, but differences do exist. And you'll note the second quote is from the American Anthropological Association. And they have a long history of pushing and advancing ideas that we would probably consider racist today. In, I believe, the 70s, they realized that what they had been pushing as science was not real, and they offered a formal apology and have been working to atone, I guess, for their past efforts over the years. They have a great exhibit that you can find online called Race, Are We So Different? One last bit about the social construct. Here I'm showing you a sampling from a few different censuses, all done in the United States. As you may know, our Constitution requires a census be done every 10 years. The first one happened in 1790, and the next one will be in 2020. So just look at how these categories have changed just in these few. Back in 1890, we separated people into categories of white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. You may not be familiar with the idea of quadroon, but that would be a person who has 1/4 of black blood in them, meaning one of their grandparents was black. Our Federal Census Bureau counted people based on their ancestry for well over a century. Based on their partial black ancestry. If you jump forward to 1930, we no longer had those categories, but had added Mexican as its own race. Yet, just 10 years later, the Census Bureau now listed Mexicans as white. Moving into 1970, you can see Filipino, Hawaiian, and Korean are added, and then look at all the diverse categories we had in 2000. And we still don't know what the 2020 census will be. Changes being contemplated include making Hispanic a racial category as opposed to an ethnic one, creating a new race for Middle Eastern and North African peoples, among many others. I'm sharing this with you because if race were a biological reality, then these categories would not change. Once they figured them out and got them right, they would be the same. But it is a social construction, so how we decide as a society to categorize people is reflected in how we count people. And we will pause for a moment and see if there are any comments.
So John, excuse me, Catherine wrote, historically Chinese also wrote about races, which they divided into yellow, white, brown, and black. They wrote in the 19th century that the yellow and white races should rule over the brown and the black.
That's really interesting, and I appreciate you sharing that, and I'll look forward to learning more. But if they wrote that in the 19th century, that would be after this idea came about in the 18th century. So it might be that they were responding to ideas that were posed by Europeans. I could imagine if I were one of the categories that we'll look at later, and my people were shown on the bottom, I might want to respond indicating something different.
Jeanette said, will there be a list of resources that have been mentioned by the speaker? Yes, we will have that information available. And then it was pointed out, this is great information. I hope it's being recorded, and yes, it is.
Okay,
right.
thanks. And yes, every source that you will see me referencing here will be included on the formal reference list. And thank you all for your input. We're going to do that a few more times today. So I'm also going to try and move fairly quickly because I have a bad habit of putting too much content in. I'm trying to be good today. But I want to look at a few moments that, since we looked at definitions and we know white is a race and we explored that, I wonder and think about, well, when did this idea arise? If there was a time, was there a time before the idea of race, would we have called those people white? Here's a great quote from the scholar Nell Irvin Painter. And as she writes here, there were, of course, light-skinned people before the idea of race, but they didn't think of themselves as white. As the Romans moved west towards the Atlantic Ocean in their conquest, they had names for different groups of people they encountered, like Gauls, Germans, Celts, and other groups. But what made a person a member of a particular group was not and is not clear to scholars. So again, it relates, even in this case, to geography to a great degree. So moving on a bit, here's another quote from Ms. Painter. And this is a partial and incomplete list of defining moments. There are so many. But as I kind of reviewed research and prepared for this, I was struck by the idea of white people, or people that we would think of today as being white, being involved in slavery and the slave trade. Let me clarify, not being involved, but being enslaved themselves. Oftentimes when we think about slavery in America, we think about, and rightly so, the enslavement of Africans brought to America against their will. And the chattel slave trade of enslaved Africans is rooted into the very core of our country and impacts us dramatically today. You only need to turn on the TV or put up a news page or put up Twitter and you can see evidence of that. But I was surprised to learn that slavery and indentured servitude of Europeans was so common, and that I hadn't been taught much about it in my studies. I want to make a point that I'm sharing this information about white slavery for knowledge and history. Some white nationalists and white supremacist groups use this idea, I think, in a manipulative way, and that is not my intent at all here. But Vikings, Italians, Ottomans drove slave trades of Tartars, Russians, Circassians, Greeks, Moors, and Ethiopians to slave markets in Germany, Italy, France, etc., although Italy was out of the slave trade in the 1500s. And initially, some of the earliest European settlers in America were indentured servants. They would take children, homeless children, off the streets of Britain, and they would ship them to the American colonies to serve as labor. 300 children were shipped from Britain to America between 1619 and 1622. Only 12 of them were alive in 1624. And another data point I found interesting was that there were more white indentured servants than Africans in Virginia in 1650. There were 11,000 settlers in Virginia, and only 300 of them were of African descent. Indeed, 20% of the Puritans on the Mayflower were indentured servants. I found all of that surprising, shocking even. The idea that 1 out of every 5 people on the Mayflower were indentured servants doesn't fit with some of the mythology around the Plymouth and the Mayflower. So moving on from there, as you can see, we're moving into the formation of our country. So from that data point about 1650, kind of meanwhile, back in Europe, the earliest known racial classification scheme was published. And this is the earliest known to me, but also to the scholar that I'm getting this from, who is still now urban painter on this one. But Bernier came up with this racial classification scheme. That is a picture of the publication cover, and his was partly based on physical appearance. So we're going to move on to a few others.
Before you move on to the next slide, I'd like to take a moment to address a couple of comments that are online. It states, how can you compare the African slave trade to being a servant? There is no comparison, and I feel this information is misleading, as these servants were not stripped of their culture and their heritage. They were not robbed of their heritage. The comparison is bananas.
Thank you. And I appreciate that comment. And let me clarify a bit. I am not trying to draw a comparison between the trade of enslaved Africans and what that has meant for our country and for them and for the societies that they were forcibly and horrifically taken from in Africa. What I am offering is that there were people we would consider white who were indentured servants at the time, and there are some primary sources from that period of time that indicate that the conditions many of those indentured servants were kept in were abhorrent. But I completely agree that taking these ideas or drawing a direct comparison between those white indentured servants and what happened with people we would now call African Americans would be inappropriate, and that is not my intent. That would be bananas, I agree. And I think the bananas part that I forgot your name, is what I was trying to get at, that some of those white nationalist groups probably try and make. And I'm trying to not do that. So thank you.
All right. And Selena states that slavery of Africans was based on race, skin color, and there was no way out of it. It was till death at one point before you could buy your freedom. And I believe that you've already addressed that, so we can move on.
Yeah, and we're that's a helpful comment too, because to treat people in that way that Africans were, I would say, requires a dehumanization. And these classification schemes help to provide some type of scientific justification for why white Europeans and white European settlers in the American colonies could treat Africans they would enslave in these ways. So another important early racial classification scheme came from Petru Camper, and you see this image here. This is a really famous image. He used two lines, vertical and horizontal, to categorize faces. It moves from the chimpanzee at the top left to what he labeled as Negro people from Africa, and it moves to European people, and then you see on the far right is the statue of Apollo, which to him was the ideal face. What was interesting about Camper is that he believed in the unity of mankind, and he didn't offer this drawing as a justification for treating Africans poorly. Instead, he even argued that Adam and Eve were black, but people came to view only the order of the faces here, which what resonated with him. Also, at the same time as he is writing this, Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, developed the taxonomic scheme that we are all familiar with now. That would be the way we classify plants and animals. So that attempt at scientific classification of superiority is happening all at the same time as this, as the slave trade of enslaved Africans was going on. So next, and perhaps one of the most important figures was Blumenbach. He, in some ways, advanced human taxonomy. He stopped referring to some people as monsters and began calling them diseased people, which was progress. He also began the scientific classification of human beings by skin color and other bodily measurements, notably skulls. He measured the heights of foreheads, the size of jawbones, the angle of teeth, eye sockets, and nasal bones. He initially created 4 and then 5 varieties. What really shocks me is that Blumenbach even found that climate produced differences in skin color, which is what, if you recall, the anthropologists now argue. Here's a quote from him. "Our own experience teaches us every year, when in spring, very elegant and delicate women show a most brilliant whiteness of skin, contracted by the indoor life of winter." So there are these obvious contradictions of culture and climate and sample size, and Blumenbach's own biases about what was beautiful, but somehow it didn't all collapse in his mind under that weight. And I think part of the reason for that is the need to justify what was happening with enslavement, but also a desire to keep his people on top. In 1795, he released a new edition of this book, and there were 5 racial categories. And here they are in rank of beauty and, I believe, intelligence. And notably, he described Caucasians as beautiful. And I quote, "Caucasian variety. I have taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus, both because its neighborhood, and especially its southern slope, produces the most beautiful race of men. I mean the Georgian. The blood of Georgia is the best of the East, and perhaps in the world. I have not observed a single ugly face in that country, in either sex, but I have seen angelical ones." So the reason I'm sharing all of this with you is that we say that understanding our history is an important race equity principle, and it's critical to paving a better path forward. So these ideas of race, as Blumenbach has them here from over 200 years ago, were done to us. We inherited them. We were born into a world where this classification scheme was accepted and promoted through institutional power and force. But it was not always this way. So, kind of coming back over to the U.S., and again, this is a very partial and incomplete list of what is relevant in the U.S., but there are a few here that I want to share. One, in 1790, this would be 5 years before Blumenbach's revised list that we just looked at, was the Naturalization Act, which restricted citizenship to any alien being a free white person. So they left out indentured white servants as able to become citizens, but restricted it to only white folks. And this was 3 years after the Constitution was ratified. In 1924, Asians were completely excluded from immigrating to the United States. And you see a quote here from Ian Haney Lopez that the racial prerequisite endured for over a century and a half until 1950. And indeed, in 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act upheld an origins quota, a quota system based on your national origin, eliminated an Asian exclusion, and introduced preferences for skill sets and family reunification. But white racial preferences were not removed, and they remained until 1965. Some other defining moments. In 1862, President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law, remained in place until 1934, with 270 million acres of government land being transferred almost entirely to white families. Those white families could include immigrants. So there would have been U.S. citizens at that point that weren't white, but still were unable to receive benefits through the Homestead Act. The National Housing Act was created in 1934, or passed in 1934, and created the Federal Housing Administration. Between 1934 and 1962, they offered $120 billion in home loans. 98% of those loans went to white people. And I can say my family benefited from the Homestead Act, as well as the Federal Housing Administration. A couple of more points here, and I would say we could talk about housing for an entire day too. But the GI Bill of 1944 offered low-cost mortgages, education, and low-interest loans to veterans of World War II. But largely, Black veterans were unable to take advantage of the mortgage benefit. Unemployment benefits were also very difficult for them to obtain. And if you think about your own family, buying of property, and the accumulation of wealth, homes and home ownership is the primary means of the transfer of wealth in our country. So what does that mean over a period of generations? What does that mean to our property tax values in a community and a tax base that funds our local schools? Also, it wasn't just the mortgages, but unemployment benefits as well. Under the GI Bill, veterans were guaranteed 1 year of unemployment compensation. Some industries during the war offered skilled labor positions to Blacks, but post-war, many of them returned to hiring only whites into those positions. When there were lower wage jobs, often beneath subsistence levels, they would offer those positions to blacks. If black Americans refused to take those jobs, the Veterans Administration noted that they were offered a job and refused it and would terminate their unemployment benefits. Some have argued that the greatest benefit to African Americans was that they were able to take advantage of the education component of the GI Bill. So many prospective students were able to attend historically black colleges, and a few pioneers ventured into uncharted territory, attending primarily white universities, opening doors to integration and desegregation. You see here an image related about property in Hyde Park in Austin, and you know it says it is exclusively for white people. The image is from 1915, but that process of redlining continued throughout the country for decades after.
So, John, it's very interesting that you state that arguably the greatest benefit blacks were able to take advantage of was payment for college-level courses, primarily at historically black universities. Would you also say, though, that even though that may have been the greatest benefit, it does not offset all of the other benefits that were given to white people that you have just outlined?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the greatest benefit in terms of their ability to access benefits at all, that was the one that it seemed that they were willing to allow education benefits primarily at historically black colleges and universities. But no, and the part of sharing the information around the Federal Housing Administration and VA loans is that benefit, that accumulation of wealth was denied to not just African Americans, but most Americans of color.
All right, thank you.
So more comments and ideas. What other bananas things am I saying on here?
Well, Karen states, it was my understanding from the history I've read that it was mainly the poor European settlers that came over as indentured servants, and that it was the only way to come to the new colonies, etc., and that it was also common practice for many of those white early settlers that later on ventured into the western areas also took in many young children, even as servants, and that this was often a way to punish the children that were labeled as delinquents, send them to the west to work in the fields, etc., and many were never allowed to return to their families. The same for any person deemed unsavory in the eyes of authorities in the earlier times.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
All right. And Chloe is asking, what is the goal of this? So I'm not really sure what in general. All right. So she's asking specifically, how does the information you just presented, how is that going to help with cultural competence? And I believe that you are about to tie that in as we proceed through the webinar.
I hope so. That's my hope. But a race equity principle that we use in our work is understanding our history. So I think it's important for us as we work in communities that people might call disadvantaged or underserved. When we go into neighborhoods where poor people of color are concentrated, that doesn't necessarily happen by choice, but that our systems played a role in constructing those dynamics. And if we are to be effective and equitable members of those systems, then it helps us to understand the history better, in my opinion.
All right. I believe from reading this that there needs to be a little bit further clarification. The concern is that if you are leading people to believe that, well, white folks were slaves too, that normalizes what happens and minimizes any progress that can be made moving forward.
Yeah. Can you read that again for me?
The concern is if people are required to take this course and are led to believe, well, white folks were slaves too, that normalizes what happens and minimizes any progress that we can make moving forward. So I think the point is for you to address, typically the way I'm understanding this is that white people have used this concept of white people were slaves too to minimize the slave trade in America and the treatment of slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you clarify your point of view on that?
Sure. And that again, that is very much not my intent. And I'm not trying to equate indentured servitude of whites or even the slavery of whites in antiquity 2,000 years ago with the chattel slave trade of African Americans that is the foundation of our country at all. At the same time, I do think it is valuable to know that history, and I'm not offering it up to be divisive.
All right.
Or to establish some kind of false equivalency. And I think what is different about America is that it was built into our Constitution from the beginning, which is very different from the tribal slavery that happened before we organized ourselves into societies thousands of years ago. So I appreciate the comments. I know it's a challenging subject to discuss, and yeah.
Thank you. Sandra states historical perspective is important to know. She just wanted to make that point in reinforcing your point. All right.
Yeah, thank you all. So moving on, kind of shifting gears to our third and fourth objective. Here you see a definition of implicit bias. These are the biases that lie in our unconscious. Some people call them our unconscious bias. They are both favorable and unfavorable, and they're activated involuntarily and without our individual awareness or intentional control. And so they are not accessible to us through thinking. So you can't reflect on them because they lie in the deeper parts of our mind than that. So some folks at Harvard developed what is called the implicit association test. It measures the strength of associations between concepts and social concepts, and evaluations of people in those categories. So, white people, black people, they have them for all kinds of domains around age and size and gender and sexuality, among others. The idea is that you respond quickly and they can test your how you associate terms in your mind. With a group of other white people that were kind of studying and discussing race equity, we took this test to assess our biases towards African Americans. This was a group of about 6 of us. And they're all of those folks at the time were professionals whose job was to work on racial equity. And all of us displayed a slight, I forget the language they use, a slight bias towards African Americans. And we were, I think, all disturbed but not surprised. Some might say that implicit bias is a defining part of the human experience, that categorizing people quickly is an adaptive mechanism to our world. I would encourage all of you to go on and give the IAT a shot sometime. But that leads me to this definition of internalized racial superiority. We often talk about it, the flip side of it, internalized racial inferiority. That, for whatever reason, for many reasons, is often more comfortable for, say, white people in particular to talk about. But examining how the social construct of race has impacted white people like me and our deeper thinking is something we don't talk about as much. So here is that definition, and we're going to look at some manifestations of internalized racial superiority.
Why are these manifestations important? Why is it important to discuss these manifestations in terms of cultural responsiveness, or as a previous person used the term cultural competence?
I think it's critically important. And it's important so that we can be aware of how our socialization impacts our behavior. And our behavior is what defines us as professionals. So I can speak of myself. Before I became aware of these concepts and began working on identifying them in myself, I might act out in some ways, say, by being angry with a parent that looked different from me and was say, acting in a way that I was not accustomed to. I might impose my standards of how a family should be when I'm developing a taste plan with them, rather than recognizing that families are different and people come from different places, and you can be a safe parent without parenting according to a white standard or a white norm. That is one of many reasons. It's also important so that we don't create policies or really operate from a place of this internalized superiority. It's also helpful to teach young people to navigate a world where many of us walk around with these internalizations.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. One of the big ones on here that I want to talk about for a moment is guilt, and you see it there at the bottom. It should be on top in giant red letters. And I know oftentimes when we're having race equity conversations, sometimes white people feel guilty, or they might think that they are being made to feel guilty. And I know I have certainly experienced guilt on my journey. And I think that is because I try and be a humane person. And the idea that I would have benefits that others don't simply because of a condition that I was born into and have no control over troubles me. But I believe we white folks must kind of deal with our guilt so that we can move forward and be productive in supporting a movement to where all people, regardless of their skin tone or their racial group, can benefit fairly in our society.
All right. So, John, you talked about in terms of the manifestations of internalized racial superiority, and you focused in on guilt. Can you talk a little bit more about escapism and arrogance, avoidance, how those things play into our day-to-day understanding and day-to-day work as far as with our children and families?
Yeah, let me try that one on. Well, let's start with arrogance. I shared with you all a story earlier about when I was a 24-year-old caseworker, and I was working with an African-American father, and I didn't have children at the time, and there is something almost inherently arrogant about the dynamic where a 24-year-old with no children would be telling an adult with multiple children how they should parent. But I could approach a conversation with this man from a place of arrogance, knowing that I have my badge and the institutional power of the state of Texas behind me. And arrogance and internalized racial superiority, its expression can come out that we know what is right, that our ideas are the best, and that they matter the most. And that can be harmful in terms of case planning. I think all of these can be harmful in how we interact with other human beings, whether they are our colleagues, our friends, our managers, or our clients. But it can inhibit a client's ability to properly access our system. It can shut down people from asking for assistance. So these are not only important for casework professionals, but teachers as well, and any human serving professional. Escapism, for me, gets at our desire as white folks to avoid having conversations like this and move into areas where we are more comfortable. That might be issues of class or gender or disability. And another one you wanted me to mention?
I'd like you to talk about the entitlement privilege and the avoidance.
Okay.
We often hear about the term white privilege.
Yeah.
And I believe that it is directly a manifestation of that internalized racial superiority.
Yeah.
And since that is a term that is often used, I wanted you to address that along with the avoidance aspect.
Okay. So, and I know I've mentioned white privilege, and for those of you that may not be familiar with that concept, you can find it very quickly. But white privilege, in terms of IRRS, or internalized racial superiority, speaks to our expectation that we will be treated a certain way by institutions and by the people within them. We hear the term driving while black. We know that African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be asked for consent searches by law enforcement when they're pulled over. But we also know that white people are more likely to have contraband in their car. So if the point is to find more contraband, then why would we, and we know that year after year, I'm speaking of Austin here, by the way, we know year over year that white people were more likely to have contraband, why would we not tell our law enforcement, you need to ask more white folks for consent searches? I think that speaks to how privilege is baked into our institutions. It can be the expectation of getting a promotion, and if a person of color is promoted, expressing that, well, they only got that position because the hiring authority was a person of color. And also, these manifestations they overlap with one another. So I might sit in silence during a discussion about delivering equitable services as a white person, while I'm also avoiding having to talk about the topic of race and kind of escaping from the dialogue entirely. I might have an expectation of comfort that I won't be challenged on my white privilege in a professional context.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and goodness, we should spend all day just on that one side too.
All right. So the next question I believe you are about to get to, which was, oops, sorry about that. How do you best address the internalization so they are minimized or eliminated?
Oh, yeah, that's a wonderful question.
And then
it's like two sides away.
All right.
Maybe three.
Okay, so we're going to get to that one. Would subtle racism be considered a manifestation of internalized racial superiority?
Yes, absolutely. Microaggressions, if you're familiar with that term, are another great example of internalized racial superiority, where we can be demeaning to other people and we may not even realize that we're doing that.
What gives whites the right to be superior over all other races?
Well, initially, our Constitution did in America, but now I can't think of anything. I don't know that we have the right, but part of what I wanted to share with you, explore with you all today, is how some tidbits along the way of how we went from there being no idea of white people to now having these institutions where, as the commenter noted, where white people are at the top in them in terms of our outcomes, our access, and our treatment by them. And if you look back when we talked about Blumenbach and those categories, it was created with white people on top by white people a few hundred years ago, and even more building up to that. So even though there isn't anything that gives us the right, certainly not in any moral or ethical sense of the word, but systems were created to do that regardless. And we were born into an environment where those systems existed to benefit people that looked like me at the expense of people that looked like Tanya and many of our colleagues and friends. And I don't think that's right. And it takes our work to change that. And part of that is understanding these manifestations and trying to minimize them in ourselves. So one last thing about this is that if we accept that bias is a part of the human condition, and then we've examined a bit of history about how these views of whites as superior began, then it follows that we would internalize these negative perceptions about people of color and positive ones about white folks. So that will require changing this dynamic, continuing to change it, will require a lot of undoing for us as individuals, in our communities, and in our systems. So a few slides here about strategies, and then we'll use the rest of our time for any comments and discussion. This is a decision-making map borrowed from a training that the office does. And this is a basic service delivery map. If you think about how you get almost any service, public or private, there's an intake phase, an assessment phase, a service delivery, a reassessment as to whether or not those services are needed, and then at any point, it can be ended or closed. Every time that we make a decision, no matter what our role is within an institution, we have an opportunity for our implicit bias to impact that decision. And our implicit bias is impacted by the race construct. So another way to flip this is that every decision is an opportunity to strive for equity, to ensure equity in that decision. So these strategies are for white folks, but I imagine they would be relevant for everybody. But we can look at our own data and our own decision making to examine, are we treating people fairly? Not the same, but fairly. And that can be, even if you are the commissioner of an agency, you can look at your hiring decisions. Who did I offer merit raises to in the last year? Who did I offer a family team meeting to before I conducted a removal? And in many of those outcomes where we look at a systemic level at our data, we do see racial and ethnic disparities. But it takes those of us making decisions, it takes those of us making those decisions to change how we operate for our outcomes to improve. Here are a few more strategies, and this gets to a comment from a little bit ago, ways to reduce our biases. One, and this is a well-established sociological principle, that intergroup contact reduces intergroup prejudice. We've seen a lot of change in attitudes toward the LGBT community, certainly over my lifetime, but even over the last 10 years. And part of that, scholars have found, is because as they have become more integrated into our communities and we are safe to live openly, we come to see people as human beings. So this is true. There's a ton of research about this beyond these two folks. But the idea is that the more you interact with people who are different than you, then your prejudices against them can be reduced. That was also reflected in a DFPS study about our disproportionality efforts back in 2010. Another is to make positive connections with a diverse group of people, so that you socialize and you interact with folks that are different, that come from a different background than your own, and have different ideas and experiences. To experience situations that may put us outside of our comfort zone. Going out to hear a music concert that is different from what you might typically do is one example. Going to a faith service that is different from what you might normally. And I would say a strategy for all of us is accountability to ourselves, to each other, and to our organizations. It isn't easy always to elevate issues like this in an institution or an organization. But if we don't, then we won't continue to have the same dynamic.
So, John, a couple of comments. As I know we're running short on time, so the experience situations that may put us outside of our comfort zone, that relates directly back to that manifestation of internalized superiority that indicates that there is an expectation of comfort. So you are specifically stating that we need to place ourselves in, or white people need to place themselves in situations related to race and ethnicity that is outside of the comfort zone, correct?
Yes, I am, yes.
And then accountability, when you talk about accountability for ourselves, each other, and in our organizations, you are also specifically talking about white people holding other white people accountable for the manifestations of internalized racial superiority when you see them, when you observe them, etc.
Yeah, that's very important. And these things aren't easy. It doesn't mean that that it comes simply or even naturally. But if we don't interrupt them, then they won't change. And I think some of the current dialogue around proper behavior from men in power towards women is a great kind of example of accountability and how it can create positive social change. But in regards to race, it is important for other white people to name these things when we see them, and it doesn't have to be ugly or rude or public. It can be in a private dialogue. But if we aren't aware, then we can't change. And they're internalized, meaning they're buried down. So it takes work to become aware of them.
All right. As we're running out of time, I do want to get to a couple of questions. I know you have one slide left, but there are a couple of points online that I'd like to get to. It is so very helpful to have a space to hear about how race impacts our work on a daily basis. How do you think we could best carry out these difficult but very necessary conversations in our regions? And that comes from Virginia.
Yeah, I think the thing about these conversations, they are courageous conversations, and using the 4 elements of a courageous conversation, from knowing who you are a great foundation. Knowing that we aren't going to fix people, or that we ourselves are not going to be fixed with one comment or dialogue. To have patience with one another and to show one another grace and how we relate to one another. I mentioned that I felt like I really began learning a lot 12 years ago with the CPS journey. I can say I made countless mistakes along the way. I've said things that offended people. I've hurt people's feelings by acting out from a place of internalized superiority. Some of them might even be on this webinar, and they may be chuckling to themselves. And I'm quite sure that many of them have plenty that they haven't told me about even. But they have also know that I'm trying and that I want to do better, and they have allowed me to grow while also striving to hold me accountable. And I think that is critically important. They didn't dismiss me outright because of a mistake I made or a hurtful comment, but they told me about it, told me how they felt, and then it is for me to process that and move forward trying to do better.
All right. Sharon states, just a comment, all of us observe through the lenses of our own experiences. This has been shocking to me. My heritage is North African, French, and German. And then Eva states, thank you for this webinar. I feel all people of color should hear this acknowledgement from the white racist.
All right, thank you all. I appreciate your comments and patience too.
And as we wrap up, I believe this last question is very important. I recognize, folks, that it is 2:46, but I believe this last question is very important as we look at this construct. Could you please differentiate between institutional racism and systemic racism, please? Systematic racism, please. And then there's a question that says, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? The entire webinar will be posted online.
A difference between institutional and systemic. I've heard a lot of people use those interchangeably. I think maybe we could also think about it as institutional being within an institution or multiple institutions, and systemic being more broadly across many, many different institutions and systems. But I've very commonly heard them used interchangeably.
So John, as we wrap up, can you please give us some final thoughts?
Yeah, I can. And you see here some things that we didn't talk about because of time, and I don't think I have to tell anyone that's participating or listening right now that there is so much around race and ethnicity and how we relate to one another and how we can improve our communities and our systems and our conditions to the benefit of all. And it is a journey, and I think you saw on earlier slide with a graphic. It's a winding journey, and I know for me that I haven't arrived yet, and there's so much more to learn and to do for myself personally and professionally, and most definitely for the organizations that I and we work in and with, as well as within our communities. A critical strategy that we didn't talk about is organizing. So we organize ourselves to keep these issues a priority. They are uncomfortable, they are not easy, but if we want to fulfill the promise of our country and our communities, I would argue that they are necessary. And I want to thank Tanya for allowing me the opportunity to be here, and thank you all for your time and joining. And I also want to thank all of my colleagues and friends that have helped me out along the way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olson. We appreciate you joining us today. For everybody on the webinar, I want to say thank you, and we hope you will join us again in January of 2018 when we continue our Disproportionality in Child Welfare webinar series. Have a good day.